You're listening to Schmidt Talks, the podcast wing of schmidttalks.com, with writer and blogger, Heather Christena Schmidt. With a new episode each week, Schmidt Talks talks about all the things you never knew you needed to hear about in these truly dystopian times. From politics and current events to life and living, Heather covers it all in this philosophical and introspective show. Come back every Monday for a new episode and get more info on Heather and her work at schmidttalks.com. And now, for the show.
Welcome to Schmidt Talks, an extension of my long-running blog at schmidttalks.com. I'm giving this podcast thing a shot, and you've tuned in for the inaugural episode of the inaugural season. Welcome. This season is entitled Words Matter. We are living in perhaps the most perilous of American times, possibly for the entire world, and I think this is in large part to do with the reality that many of our words have lost their meaning. People seem to believe now that they don't have to mean what they say, that they can simply riff a term and it can just mean something else if they want it to, or they can later claim, it's not what I meant, even if it was. We are a society, though, living in reality, at least for now, and no matter how dystopian or absurd things get, the terms that we use to describe what we mean must retain some sense of value. Something universally agreed upon. At least it is my view that this is the first and most critical step in restoring some sense of sanity in the world that is crumbling around us. Words matter. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 1. Our first word is misinformation. A few days ago, I was, you might say, doom scrolling through Twitter, and I came across a guy with a verified account. He had that, blue check mark next to his name. He claimed himself to be a science and medical writer. He had made some sort of a gaffe with regards to the worsening outbreak of monkeypox. Now, I'm not going to give him more clout by saying his name or his handle. You can look that up for yourselves. But he posted a tweet about the outbreak with a link to the predominant associate group that the monkeypox outbreak was mostly found in. He meant to say that it was in groups of men who have sex with other men. But instead he typed, men who have sex with me, and, well, it took off. As it turns out, this was a plagiarized gaffe. If you can believe that, is what this world has come to at this point. He had apparently admitted that he would be stealing this line from another writer on Twitter in the weeks that preceded it. If it sounds like a bizarre thing to plagiarize to you, I would agree, but it ended up gaining him more followers, having an article written about him and his gaffe, and, well, he was given a much broader audience by which to forcefully purport his narrative that monkeypox was an STD for gay men. So I followed the guy too, and in the days that followed that, I saw him obsessively and forcefully give cover to homophobes, claim that monkeypox was truly a gay man's disease. I even saw multiple threads about anal sex, and in a truly bizarre moment, read a multi-tweet thread he posted claiming that the NEJM, a prominent peer-reviewed science journal, was misinformation. I wanted to think this guy, this science writer, had good intentions, or that he has good intentions, because he's still doing all of this today. But then every post I saw seemed so forceful and intentioned upon pushing a narrative that was picked up elsewhere in the media, that monkeypox is a gay man's disease, and a gay man's disease only. Soon the Associated Press had syndicated an article pretty much everywhere calling it an STD, which it is not. And while it is true that right now the prominence of cases is, in the gay community. Every time anyone was, out there discussing possibilities of spillover into other groups, kids coming up with it, different ways it could be transmitted, this guy seemed to be right there every time, just waiting to cry out misinformation. I couldn't really figure out what this was all about. Was it a homophobia? Was it his inability to understand anything, really? Then I remembered his admission that he was stealing the sex with me instead of sex with men thing. That incident of plagiarism. Plagiarism is a type of misinformation, just as his obsessive attempts at painting monkeypox a gay STD is. And then it clicked. The people that claim misinformation and disinformation the most are in fact often the ones usually committing it themselves. There certainly has been a push in the last few years to call out and crack down on misinformation and disinformation. We can thank the Biden administration and in particular the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy for all the buzz about it. In July of 2021, Murthy and the White House announced their campaign about health misinformation. Now sure, there are all kinds of misinformation out there, and to be clear, it is real and it is pervasive in our society, but I think that health misinformation probably takes the cake, and it's probably the one that affects all of us the most. The irony, of course, is that the government is perhaps the largest purveyor of propaganda and disinformation, and that is not lost on me. To make it all the more absurd, the administration thought that the best way to go about doing this would be to first bring in a slew of pop stars to make cool videos about how misinformation is bad to post on TikTok. Then with Pentatonics and the Jonas Brothers singing in the background, Biden called on all Americans to do their patriotic duty in the war against misinformation. Truly bizarre. As if this wasn't absurd enough, the CEOs of social media giants like Facebook and Twitter got involved, and while the rest is history, these companies, of course, couldn't pick through every single post, though, to determine the veracity of what each one claims. So they unleashed an arsenal of AI software intended to weed out all of the things false on the internet, patriotic duty and all that. Of course, this has only turned into otherwise innocent people being banned from their social media platforms of choice for posting vacation photos or food pictures with the wrong combination of words. But hey, bigger picture, right? We've got to fight misinformation, Jack. The loudest accusers of misinformation and disinformation are often the biggest purveyors of both. Remember that. And that's essentially how it's played out. This call to action gave the Democratic base the exact motive they needed to go after anyone and everything that they felt was peddling bad and false news, even when they knew it wasn't always true. And if that sounds familiar, the fake news, that's because it's exactly who they set their sights on. I suppose it was the obvious target. The media. Social media is surely an extension of the media, the news media. Democrats already had their targets on Fox News, admittedly for good reasons. But as soon as Biden called on Americans to wage a holy war on misinformation, they went after all media if what was being reported did not suit their narrative. If it wasn't what they liked, even if it was true, they called it misinformation. Perhaps the best example of this was when Vice President Kamala Harris went to Paris and was seen purchasing a pan at Sur La Table for several $100s. First, Fox picked it up. It was a bit tangential, but then it got syndicated and it's all anyone could talk about. No one wanted to report on her diplomatic mission after that, and can you blame them? Who cares about diplomacy when Americans have something to gossip about? This is the way it has always been. This is nothing new, except the Democratic Blue MAGA response was so extreme, so vitriolic. Even White House Chief of Staff Ronald Klain called CNN's reporting on the pan misinformed. But was it? Was it misinformed? Was it misinformation? No. If we're looking at the term literally for what it really means, it was not misinformation. She bought the damn pan while she was in Paris. Just because something is said in a way that you do not like, or is focusing on a detail that you or a group of you do not prefer, well, that doesn't make it false information, which is what misinformation actually is. Saying that you wrote a tweet you didn't really write, that's false information. Saying that the VP bought an expensive item while she was in Paris, when she did, well, that's a fact. The irony again about all of this was that when Donald Trump, arguably the worst president in American history, called the media fake news, the Democratic Party and its base constantly railed on him for calling it that. When he called him the enemy of the people, they went bananas. To be clear, I think Trump was wrong on this, or to the extreme. He was too extreme. But he wasn't entirely wrong, at least according to Biden administration's definitions. And today, it's exactly the type of the response that the Democratic base, again, has towards the media. The same media Trump was going after. But hey, if it's your guy, it's okay, right? This is why I was and continue to be so surprised that Murthy chose this to be his hill to die on. Even if you go to the U.S. Surgeon General's webpage, it is entirely about his campaign to stop misinformation. I suppose in these dystopian times that we live, inside the D.C. echo chamber, you really cannot see that you are just as much the problem, that you are just as much the source of that which you claim to be wrong. But I want to get back to that science writer, the one on Twitter with the sex with me, sex with men, monkeypox thing. I would not at any point in time be surprised if we one day found out that this guy was some sort of disinformation agent, either from the government because they wanted to downplay another pandemic at a time that they continue to bungle the first one that they were tasked with, or more likely some covert right-wing group that just has utility in homophobia disguised as performative, heroic medical journalism. And disinformation agents are nothing new. As far as the government is concerned, again, the American government is perhaps the largest purveyor of disinformation for the purposes of whatever their present agenda is, usually economic. Just look at how they've handled the COVID-19 pandemic over the last year or so. For more than a year now, they've allowed variants to rip through entire populations of elderly, the poor, people of color, immunocompromised individuals, indiscriminately killing people that were otherwise healthy for the sake of the economy. They removed masks and quarantine so people could go back to work, so they could feel more comfortable going on vacation, so they could appease the CEOs of big companies like Delta Airlines and Applebee's. And so they could get back to, getting people shopping at strip malls. The pandemic of the unvaccinated, that was a disinformation campaign meant to cover their own failures, to recognize and acknowledge that the vaccines would not stop people from getting COVID, and that they ignored one variant after another until things got out of control. Misinformation has been, as I said, a pervasive aspect of modern life for decades. Disinformation and propaganda, I would argue that's gone on since the dawn of civilization. Even when you look at the types of health information that Vivek Murthy is setting his sights on, like the anti-vax movement, that has been going on for decades. Anti-vaccine sentiments were not invented with the COVID vaccines, and they will not die with Murthy's war on COVID misinformation either. I live in Southern California, the land of anti-vaxxers. We've been battling measles outbreaks because of these people since my now adult daughter was a baby. So why now? Why unleash this war? Why sick the misinformation and disinformation hounds on anyone and everyone that dares to utter, well, anything? Because just about everything and anything can be considered misinformation to someone. even if it's not false information per se. Sometimes it is false information, but sometimes it's real information that someone just doesn't like. Sometimes it's true, but not true enough, or the person calling it misinformation would simply prefer you focus on something else. Sometimes misinformation is a person, like they walk into the room and you just know they're going to say something you shouldn't believe. Misinformation is a tool, a means to get people to do something they may otherwise not want to do. And a lot of times, misinformation is just information that was true once and never got updated. You can see why we as a society are in such a mess, and somehow we play a part in it. We have all, I am sure of it, at one time or another recently been guilty of spreading misinformation about any given topic. Maybe we clicked before we read, or we just didn't know the newest science or data. Maybe we accused someone of misinformation when it was just something we didn't think was credible. It doesn't make us bad people. Well, not all of us. It just highlights how deeply problematic this is. But who is really behind the misinformation campaigns anyway? I don't mean the campaign against misinformation. I mean the misinformation itself. The true misinformation, the false information, like that vaccines have aborted babies in them. Knowing what we know about how it spreads and how hard it is to refute a claim once it has been made, it stands to reason that the true disinformation agents in all of this stand to gain something from all the chaos that comes along with it. But how is that any different at all from the chaos coming from the war on misinformation? The two seem equally consequential, equally deconstructive to society at this point, and keep us so wrapped up in this noise that we do not pay attention or time to all of the other really important stuff going on around us. In the end, I think that's kind of the point. Misinformation is false information. Disinformation is information spread to intentionally deceive. These two words, they have meaning, and their meanings are as simple as that. There's no reason for us to look deeper, to stretch the bounds of those meanings, to apply them in abstract and complex ways, to do our patriotic duty, to recognize it and call it out. People are going to believe what they want to believe anyway. They are not going to be convinced by a report on Facebook, by a video of the Jonas Brothers singing about misinformation or knowing the truth. They're not going to be convinced by an argument in the line at the grocery store. Words matter, but if we manipulate them, they lose what makes them them. The good news is that if we leave them alone long enough, use them only when absolutely appropriate, one day they again reclaim their meaning. Thanks for tuning in.
You've been listening to Schmidt Talks, the podcast wing of schmidttalks.com, with writer and blogger Christena Schmidt. With a new episode each week, Schmidt Talks talks about all the things you never knew you needed to hear about in these truly dystopian times. Thank you for listening, and make sure to come back every Monday for a new episode. You can get more info on Heather, her social media channels, and all of her work at schmidttalks.com. Stay safe.